A scream shattered the silence of an abandoned house. A young girl was dragged into the dark, unseen, unheard. In the freezing night, a retired Navy SEAL heard what others ignored and made a choice that defied fear. Bullets fell, blood stained the snow, and a loyal dog stood between evil and hope. One life saved would shake a powerful empire and reveal a miracle hidden in the dark. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Detroit lay buried under winter, snow swallowing abandoned factories while the wind cut through steel and silence. In that frozen emptiness, a retired soldier and his dog walked where no one else dared. James Walker had learned that some nights were heavier than others, not because of the cold was familiar, manageable, but because of the quiet that pressed in from all sides, sharp enough to draw blood from old memories. He walked slowly through the industrial district, boots crunching against snow, breath steady, measured, disciplined, the way it had been trained to be for most of his adult life. Rex moved beside him without a leash, close enough that James could feel the dog's presence even without looking. He didn't need to. Rex was always there, loyal, alert, grounded in the present in a way James no longer was. This walk wasn't for exercise or habit. It was a ritual, one that kept James from sinking back into the parts of himself that only came alive in the dark. Detroit at night felt like a battlefield after the smoke cleared, empty, scarred, unforgiving. The factories stood hollow and skeletal, their broken windows staring blindly into the snow. James avoided these places during daylight, when the city felt too alive, too crowded, too unpredictable. But at night, among ruins and silence, nothing demanded explanations from him. No one asked who he used to be. No one cared what he had done or failed to do. Out here, the world made sense again. Lines of sight, open ground, shadows that behaved like shadows were supposed to. Rex stopped. Not suddenly, not nervously. The dog's body shifted with intention, muscles tightening, head lifting slightly into the wind. James noticed the change instantly. Years of training responded before thought could interfere. His pace slowed, his breathing deepened, his focus sharpened. He followed Rex's gaze into the darkness ahead, expecting movement, heat, threat. At first, there was nothing. Just snow drifting across cracked concrete and the low moan of wind threading through rusted steel. Then he heard it. A sound too small to belong in a place like this, fragile, broken, a voice fighting the cold and losing. James felt the tension coil inside his chest, familiar and unwelcome. He closed his eyes for half a second, just long enough to recognize the moment for what it was. A choice. He had built his life around avoiding moments like this, around walking away before instinct took over, around telling himself that survival meant distance. That involvement led only to consequences he could no longer afford to carry. He was done being the first one in, done being the man who ran toward gunfire instead of away from it. He had paid for that version of himself already. The sound came again, weaker this time, threaded with panic and exhaustion. James exhaled slowly. Not tonight, he told himself, not again. He had heard too many voices like that in his life, too many that ended abruptly, too many that followed him into sleep afterward, asking questions he couldn't answer. He could turn around now. He could pretend the wind had played tricks on him. He could go home, lock the door, sit in silence with Rex until morning came. That was the smart choice, the safe one. Rex looked back at him. There was no fear in the dog's eyes, no hesitation, only readiness. Rex did not pull forward or urge him on. He simply waited, grounded and steady, as if the decision had already been made, and James was the only one catching up. Something inside James cracked then, not dramatically, not cleanly, but enough to hurt. He remembered another night, another hesitation, Another voice over a radio that went quiet because he'd been half a second too late. He remembered living with that sound afterward, how it never really left. "Damn it," he whispered, more tired than angry. They moved. The factory rose before them, dark and vast, its entrance yawning open like a wound. James adjusted his jacket automatically, checking balance, range of motion, weight. Old habits surfaced, without permission. Rex slipped ahead, silent, controlled, moving with the same disciplined purpose James recognized from a lifetime ago. The air felt wrong as they approached, heavy with tension that didn't belong to empty buildings. James told himself he was imagining it, that years of hypervigilance had trained his body to see threats where none existed. The voice cut through the wind again, closer now, and the lie collapsed. James stepped inside. The cold changed instantly, thickening, swallowing sound. The smell of rust, oil, and abandonment filled his lungs. He paused, letting his eyes adjust, letting his breathing settle into a rhythm he trusted. Rex stayed close, a living anchor. Movement flickered ahead, a shape bound in shadow, a figure slumped against steel. The girl looked small in a way that had nothing to do with her size. Snow had melted into her clothes, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her eyes found James and locked onto him with a desperation so raw it felt like a physical blow. In that moment, James understood the real danger of this place. Not the guns, not the men he hadn't seen yet. It was being seen, being needed again. He took a step toward her. Footsteps echoed. Everything happened at once. Rex lunged toward the sound with a low, ferocious growl, throwing himself into the chaos without hesitation. James moved at the same time, hands already working at restraints, voice steady even as his heart hammered. He told her it was okay, even though he didn't believe it. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the enclosed space. Pain slammed into James's chest, knocking the air from his lungs, staggering him back a half step. He stayed upright by instinct, alone. Somewhere in the noise, the girl cried out, then went slack in his arms, her weight sudden and terrifyingly still. James tightened his grip. Not again, not another one. Rage flared, sharp and focused, burning through the pain. Rex fought like he had been born for this moment, not wild or reckless, but precise, driven by instinct and loyalty. The dog bought seconds James didn't deserve. James lifted the girl, muscles screaming in protest, vision narrowing. He did not look back as they burst through the factory doors into the storm. Snow and wind swallowed the sound of gunfire behind them. James ran, every step fueled by stubborn refusal. Whatever this night demanded from him, it would not take her quietly. Not while he was still standing. Snow thickened across Detroit's industrial outskirts as night deepened, the wind erasing footprints almost as quickly as they formed, turning every escape into a temporary illusion. James ran until his lungs burned and his injured side throbbed with each breath, the girl's unconscious weight pressed against his chest like a promise he had not meant to make. Pain tried to demand his attention, but he refused it, compartmentalizing the way he had been trained to do long ago. Survival first, assessment later. Rex moved beside him with relentless focus, mind stripped of everything except the need to keep moving and keep them alive, his instincts shaped by years of following James through danger without question. The world narrowed to snow, breath, and the fragile rise and fall of the girl's chest. James did not know her name, her age, or why armed men had wanted her badly enough to shoot without hesitation. He only knew the sound her voice had made before it vanished into silence, and how deeply that silence now clawed at him. Every few steps he checked her breathing, counting without counting, listening for any change that would mean he had failed again. Failure had a weight to it, one he carried even when nothing was visibly wrong, forged from names he no longer spoke, and faces he tried not to remember. Rex sensed the tension in him and adjusted his pace, never crowding, never pulling ahead, offering presence rather than reassurance. James focused on that rhythm because focusing on anything else meant acknowledging the fear rising in his throat. He had not planned beyond escape. Planning beyond escape implied commitment, and commitment had ruined him once before. He ducked through an alley choked with snow and broken pallets, pausing long enough to press his gloved hand against the wound beneath his jacket, feeling warmth that did not belong in winter. The pain was sharp but controlled, manageable for now. He told himself he had endured worse. He had told himself that many times before, and it was never quite true, but it was close enough to function. The girl stirred once, a faint sound catching in her throat, and James tightened his grip, whispering words meant as much for himself as for her, promising nothing specific, only presence. Rex froze abruptly, posture shifting, senses stretching outward. James followed the cue instantly, lowering himself behind a stack of frozen debris, heart hammering as distant voices cut through the wind. He did not recognize the language of their anger, only the intent, searching, hunting. He waited, muscles screaming from stillness, until the sounds faded, and Rex relaxed by degrees, never fully letting go. Movement resumed, slower now, more deliberate. James chose paths that limited angles and exposure, instincts mapping terrain faster than conscious thought. As they moved, memories intruded uninvited, flashes of snow in another country, another life, another night when carrying someone had ended with a body he could not save. He shoved the thought aside with practiced brutality. This was not that night. This girl was breathing. That had to be enough. He reached the edge of a derelict loading area and considered options, calculating distances, cover, time. He needed shelter, somewhere enclosed enough to slow pursuit and give him minutes instead of seconds. Minutes could mean life. Rex's gaze tracked a darkened structure ahead, its outline barely visible through snowfall, and James understood. He did not like the choice, but he took it, because survival was rarely about liking. As they moved toward it, James felt the full cost of his decision settle in. He was no longer passing through the night. He was shaping it. Whatever happened next would be because he had stepped inside that factory and refused to leave alone. The girl shifted again, breath shallow but present, and James felt something unfamiliar cut through his exhaustion. Responsibility. Not the abstract kind assigned by orders or oaths, but the immediate personal kind that asked for nothing except endurance. Rex stayed close, a silent promise of defense, his loyalty unbroken by fear or pain. James crossed the threshold into deeper darkness with the unspoken knowledge that once you carried someone out of the cold, you could never truly put them back down again. And somewhere beyond the snow and silence, consequences were already moving toward them. Snow thickened into a blinding curtain as gunfire echoed behind them, turning the industrial outskirts into a narrow corridor where survival depended on seconds, blood, and stubborn refusal to fall. James felt the second shot before he heard it, a violent impact tearing through his shoulder and spinning him half sideways as the world narrowed to white noise and pain. Training took over before panic could form. He shifted his weight, tightened his grip on the girl, and kept moving, refusing to let momentum die. The girl did not cry out this time. Her body went slack against him, heavier than before, frighteningly still, and that terrified him more than the gunfire ever could. He checked her instinctively while running, fingers brushing her neck, counting the faint rhythm of life under his skin, anchoring himself to that fragile proof that he had not failed yet. Rex reacted instantly, the dog's focus sharpening into something almost feral, his mind stripped down to a single imperative: protect. He did not chase blindly or bark for dominance. He positioned himself between James and the advancing threat, moving in tight arcs, forcing hesitation, buying space. James staggered, nearly went down, and felt Rex press briefly against his leg. A grounding contact that said, "Keep moving, stay upright, do not stop now." The sound of boots and shouted orders cut through the wind, closer than James liked, and he knew there would be no clean escape. This was no longer about evasion alone. It was about resistance long enough to disappear. He ducked behind a line of rusted equipment and lowered the girl to one knee, shielding her with his body as bullets chewed into metal nearby. He returned fire sparingly, not to kill, but to disrupt, aiming where noise mattered more than impact. Each shot sent fresh pain through his shoulder, and he welcomed it because pain meant he was still conscious, still capable of choosing. Rex lunged at a shadow that moved too fast, teeth snapping inches from fabric, forcing a retreat that felt like victory only because it lasted long enough. James hauled the girl back up, gritting his teeth as blood soaked deeper into his jacket, the cold already stiffening his fingers. He could feel strength bleeding out of him in steady increments, time measured now in heartbeats instead of minutes. The girl stirred once, a faint tremor, then slipped fully into unconsciousness, her head rolling against his chest. James murmured to her without realizing it, low and steady, telling her to hold on, telling himself the same thing. He did not know why he needed her to live beyond the obvious. He only knew that carrying her had awakened something he had buried deliberately, a sense of purpose unconnected to orders or flags, something dangerously personal. Rex sensed the shift and adjusted, his movements tighter, more aggressive, driven by the memory of past fights that had taught him when retreat was no longer enough. James felt another round tear past his ear and understood that the line between escape and collapse was closing fast. He changed direction abruptly, choosing a path that cut across open ground toward darker structures ahead, places where sound would echo and visibility would fail. It was a calculated risk, the kind he had sworn never to take again after leaving the service, but calculation was still preferable to surrender. His legs burned, breath ragged, vision tunneling, and still he ran. Rex moved like a shadow at his side, intercepting pursuit, forcing angles that bought seconds James spent on forward motion. Somewhere behind them, frustration replaced coordination, voices overlapping, discipline breaking under the strain of the unexpected. James seized that weakness and pushed harder, knowing his body was approaching its limit. He stumbled once, caught himself, and felt Rex circle instinctively, creating a living barrier while James regained balance. The girl remained motionless, her weight unchanging, and fear gnawed at him despite his attempts to keep it contained. He told himself that unconscious did not mean gone, that people shut down to survive, that this was temporary, that he would not lose her in the snow. As they reached the edge of another structure, James felt the world tilt again, pain flaring bright enough to steal his breath. He leaned into the wall, pressed his forehead briefly against cold metal, and forced himself to stay present. The past threatened to intrude, reminding him of other nights when carrying someone had ended in silence, but he shoved it back with ruthless focus. Rex stood between him and the open space behind them, body tense, a low sound vibrating in his chest that spoke of loyalty deeper than fear. James made a decision then, clear and final. He would not fight them here. He would not stand and be overwhelmed. He would move again, even if it tore what remained of him apart, because the girl's breathing, faint as it was, still existed, and as long as it did, he had something worth protecting. He shifted his grip, braced himself, and moved toward deeper cover, knowing that the next place they stopped would have to be one where he could no longer run, and that when that moment came, the night would demand a different kind of endurance altogether. The warehouse crouched at the edge of the industrial zone, its metal walls groaning under wind and snow, a hollow refuge offering silence at the cost of trapping whatever entered inside. James forced the door shut behind them with what little strength remained, the clang echoing too loudly before the cold swallowed it, and then there was only breath and darkness, and the unbearable stillness of the girl in his arms. He lowered her to the concrete, with care that felt almost reverent, kneeling despite the way his injured shoulder screamed in protest, and for a moment he allowed himself to stop moving, to assess, to acknowledge the fear he had been outrunning since the first shot. The girl was unconscious, skin cold, breath shallow but present, and that single fact anchored him more firmly than any order ever had. He stripped off his outer layer with clumsy fingers and used it to insulate her from the concrete, hands working automatically, guided by memory rather than thought, because thinking invited doubt, and doubt invited collapse. He checked for bleeding, pressed where he needed to press, adjusted her position to keep her airway clear, murmuring steady words that were not meant to wake her, but to remind himself that she was still here, that she had not slipped away while he was busy fighting ghosts. Rex took position near the door without being told, his body language shifting into vigilance, senses stretched outward, tracking sounds James could no longer afford to focus on. The dog's presence was a quiet reassurance, not because Rex could stop bullets forever, but because he would warn James before the world crashed back in. When James was satisfied that the girl would survive the next few minutes, he turned his attention inward and immediately felt the cost of delaying it. Blood had soaked through his jacket and stiffened in the cold, each movement sending sharp reminders through his chest and shoulder. He leaned back against a crate and forced himself to breathe slowly, to keep the dizziness at bay, to become methodical instead of reactive. He reopened the wound with fingers that trembled more from exhaustion than pain, cleaned it as best he could with snow and cloth, and bound it tight, jaw clenched to keep from making a sound. This was familiar territory, the quiet aftermath when adrenaline drained away and left only consequences behind. He had done this before, alone, in worse places, and that knowledge steadied him even as his vision blurred at the edges. Rex glanced back once, checking him, then returned his focus to the door, a low sound vibrating in his chest whenever the wind shifted in a way that suggested movement outside. James watched the girl's breathing rise and fall, and felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with injury. He still did not know who she was or why men had hunted her so aggressively, and part of him understood that ignorance was a temporary mercy. Names created attachments, and attachments created pain, but it was too late to pretend detachment now. He had carried her out of gunfire, had chosen her life over his own sense of safety, and the choice had settled into him with uncomfortable permanence. Memories intruded again, uninvited, of other shelters hastily chosen, of other wounded bodies he had tried to keep warm while waiting for extraction that came too late or not at all. He pushed those images aside, refusing to let the past dictate the present, reminding himself that this time he was not waiting for anyone else to arrive. This time, he was the only thing standing between life and silence. Minutes stretched, measured by breath, and the distant hum of wind against steel, and James forced himself to remain still, conserving what strength he could. He listened for pursuit, for engines, for voices, and heard nothing, which unsettled him more than noise would have. Rex remained tense, every instinct telling him this was not over, that the absence of sound meant the world was merely drawing closer in a different way. James rested his head briefly against the crate behind him, eyes closed not in surrender but in calculation, knowing that rest was a resource as vital as ammunition. When he opened his eyes again, the girl remained unconscious, unchanged, and that consistency felt like a small victory he did not allow himself to celebrate. He adjusted his position slightly, placing himself between her and the door, accepting without argument the role his body now played. Somewhere beyond the warehouse walls, he sensed movement gathering, intent reorganizing, and he knew that shelter was temporary by nature. The night had given him a pause, nothing more, and pauses always ended. As Rex's low warning deepened, James tightened his grip on the little strength he had left, understanding that the next time the door opened, running would no longer be an option, and whatever came through it would force him to stand his ground. The warehouse did not announce the attack with sound, but with pressure, a sudden shift in the air that told James the night had finally decided to close its fist. James felt it before he saw it. The subtle tightening that came when intent aligned outside the walls, when scattered pursuit became coordinated action. Rex's low warning deepened, vibrating through the concrete, and James rose despite the way his injured body protested, placing himself instinctively between the girl and the door, accepting the role without hesitation or illusion. He knew how this ended. There were too many angles, too little strength left, and nowhere else to run. The door gave way under force, metal screaming as it buckled inward, and light flooded the warehouse in harsh, disorienting beams. Armed figures poured in with practiced efficiency, movements controlled and deliberate, not the chaos of men firing blindly, but the precision of those who expected resistance and were prepared to crush it. James did not raise his weapon. He did not need to. He spread his stance, shielding the girl's unconscious body with his own, shoulders squared, eyes locked forward, daring them to take another step. Rex surged ahead, teeth bared, positioning himself in front of James with a ferocity born not of rage but of duty, a final line drawn in instinct rather than command. For a moment, the standoff held, tension coiled so tight it felt as if the air might snap. James knew better than to hope. Hope was a luxury for people with options. The first blow came hard and fast, knocking him sideways, pain exploding through his ribs as he hit the ground and struggled back up on pure will. Hands grabbed at him, dragging him away despite his resistance, boots slamming into his side when he tried to twist free. He fought without strategy now, without expectation of victory, every movement driven by a single purpose: keep their attention on him. He saw the girl lifted carefully, her body handled with urgency that told him she was valuable to them alive, and the knowledge burned through him even as his strength failed. Rex lunged again and was forced back, restrained but not subdued, his growls echoing through the space like a promise that this was not over. James was pinned, bound, hauled upright, blood dripping steadily into the snow-dusted floor, his vision blurring at the edges. He did not beg. He did not speak. Silence was the last thing he could still control. They moved him quickly, efficiently, as if his resistance had been anticipated and already discounted. The warehouse emptied as abruptly as it had filled, leaving behind only echoes and the lingering sense of violence contained rather than spent. Time lost meaning after that. James registered motion, cold air, the press of restraints, then darkness broken by stark artificial light. The room they brought him into was bare, functional, designed to strip away context and comfort. Rex was forced down beside him, held at a distance that was close enough to matter and far enough to threaten, the dog's body taut with restrained aggression, eyes never leaving James. Questions came, sharp and repetitive, demanding names, affiliations, explanations James did not possess or refused to give. He answered none of them. Each refusal earned him pain measured carefully, administered not in fury, but in methodical increments meant to wear him down. James focused on Rex through it all, on the dog's steady presence and unwavering defense, drawing strength from the simple fact that loyalty like that did not break under pressure. Somewhere beyond the walls of the room, decisions were being made, calculations unfolding that James could not see, and he understood with grim clarity that the girl's survival now hinged on forces larger than his endurance alone. As the interrogation dragged on, James felt his consciousness fray at the edges, not from pain, but from exhaustion, and he wondered briefly whether this was how it ended, not with gunfire, but with silence and unanswered questions. Then the door opened again, and the shift in the room was immediate, palpable, as if authority itself had stepped inside. James lifted his head with effort, meeting the gaze of someone whose presence changed the behavior of everyone else without a word being spoken. He did not know who the man was, only that power settled around him like gravity, undeniable and heavy. The man looked at James, then at Rex, then at the restraints, and something unreadable crossed his expression. James held the stare without defiance or submission, too tired for either, aware only that whatever happened next would not be decided by his strength. The man turned away without explanation, issuing orders James could not hear, and the room erupted into controlled motion. James was left kneeling, bound, breath ragged, Rex pressed close despite the handler's efforts. And in that suspended moment, James realized that the girl was no longer within his reach, and that the consequences of saving her were only just beginning to reveal themselves. Winter light filtered weakly through hospital glass and concrete walls, separating two worlds at once, one where life returned in quiet beeps and tears, and another where loyalty and pain waited behind locked doors. Consciousness returned to the girl slowly, not as clarity but as sensation, the sterile smell of antiseptic first, then the dull ache spreading through her body, and finally the sound that broke her open completely, her own voice, as she sobbed uncontrollably, clutching at the man beside her bed, before she even understood who he was. Her father stood frozen for a heartbeat, a man accustomed to command and fear, suddenly stripped of both by the sight of his daughter alive and broken, and when she finally managed to speak through shaking breaths, the words came out raw and uneven, telling him that it was the soldier who had saved her, that the man with the dog had stood in front of bullets meant for her, had carried her through snow and darkness, had refused to leave even when it would have meant his own death. The father listened without interruption, something heavy and dangerous settling behind his eyes, a memory resurfacing of a younger version of himself who once believed power was protection, before learning too late that it only invited violence. When the doctors gently ushered him away, assuring him she would recover, his grief hardened into resolve, and he turned without ceremony, issuing orders that rippled outward immediately, the kind that bent rooms and people alike. Miles away, beneath flickering industrial lights, James knelt on cold concrete, wrists bound, body bruised and exhausted beyond pain, existing in a narrow space where endurance replaced hope. Rex lay at his feet, not resting but coiled, every instinct sharpened, the dog's growl low and constant, warning anyone who stepped too close that whatever happened next would not come without cost. The interrogators had stopped hours ago, either satisfied that James knew nothing of value or unwilling to push further without permission. And in the silence that followed, James drifted in and out of awareness, anchored by the steady presence beside him, by the knowledge that Rex was still there, still choosing him. When the door finally opened again, it did not slam or shout its arrival. It simply changed the air. The father entered without haste, the room rearranging itself around his authority, men stepping back instinctively, voices falling silent. He looked at James for a long moment, then at Rex, then at the marks left behind by restraint and questioning, and something like shame crossed his face, brief but undeniable. He spoke then, not to James, but to the men who had brought him here, his voice calm and absolute, ordering them to release the restraints, to step back, to kneel. One by one they did, confusion giving way to obedience as they were forced to bow their heads before the man they had just tortured. James struggled to his feet as his bonds were cut, steadying himself on instinct alone, Rex rising immediately, positioning himself protectively without aggression now, alert but controlled. The father finally addressed James directly, acknowledging the debt without embellishment, saying that his daughter lived because James had refused to abandon her, because he had stood when it would have been easier to break. He offered compensation without limit, money, protection, influence, anything that could be bought or commanded, his voice carrying the certainty of someone unused to refusal. James listened in silence, his thoughts slow but clear, pain sharpening rather than dulling his resolve. When he spoke, his answer was quiet and final, telling the man that he had not acted for reward, that saving someone did not create ownership or obligation, that some choices were made simply because they were the only ones a person could live with afterward. He asked for nothing except to leave, to walk out with Rex, and return to whatever anonymity remained to him. The refusal unsettled the room more than anger would have, and the father studied him again, this time with something closer to respect than power, understanding perhaps for the first time that there were forms of strength his empire could never purchase. He nodded once, signaling the end of it, and ordered his men to stand down, to clear a path. No one touched James as he moved, unsteady but upright, Rex glued to his side, every step a reclaiming of autonomy. Outside, the cold night waited, indifferent and clean, snow falling softly as if nothing had happened at all. James paused briefly, drawing a breath that burned his lungs, feeling the weight of survival settle over him, heavier than any wound. Behind him, the doors closed, sealing away a world of power and consequence he wanted no part of. Ahead lay uncertainty, pain, and recovery measured in long, solitary days, but also freedom chosen rather than granted. He did not look back. Rex walked with him into the falling snow, loyal as ever, and together they disappeared into the winter streets, leaving behind a debt that would never truly be repaid and carrying with them only what mattered, the knowledge that in the darkest moment they had remained who they were. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes they come quietly, wearing the face of a stranger who chooses to stand when walking away would be easier. God's grace often moves through human hands, through courage, compassion, and the refusal to abandon another soul in darkness. In everyday life, we may never face gunfire or snow-filled nights, but we are tested in smaller, quieter ways. Whether we help when no one is watching, whether we protect the vulnerable, whether we choose kindness over fear. This story is a reminder that faith is not only something we pray for, but something we live through our actions. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment to tell us how it made you feel, and subscribe to the channel so more stories of light can reach those walking in the dark. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and guide your steps with peace, strength, and mercy.